Applying the sticky paste is only the first hurdle. Weathering the Zimmerit might be just as tricky, maybe even more so. So today, I'm going to try and weather this Zimmerit covered 35th scale Brummbär without overwhelming it with oils or not going far enough and leaving it looking really flat and boring. So join me on this little ripple trip, learn from my mistakes, and judge for yourself whether or not it turned out looking like a fearsome block-busting assault gun or just a dull plastic lump. So here's the starting point. The Zimmerit is applied. It's got a base coat of paint with a green camo pattern on it. The decals are on, and I've covered it with a satin varnish. So now we're ready to start the hard work. One of the toughest parts of weathering Zimmerit is that it's just so darn tempting to hit all those beautiful grooves with a pen wash and really pull out the shadows. But if you do that, instead of shadows and contrast, you're just going to get a big oil spot. Plus, it'll end up looking a lot darker than the rest of the model, specifically those surfaces that aren't covered with Zimmerit, and that's just going to look really weird. I think pen washes work a little bit better with the square pattern Zimmerit, but the grooves on this kind of Zimmerit aren't especially deep, so this is going to call for a little restraint on my part, which admittedly is no easy thing to do when it comes to oil washes. I started with a brown oil paint. My goal here is to give the Zimmerit a grimy, used look, along with some color and some light shadow effects, with an oil paint color that usually pairs pretty well with a dark yellow German base like this. Instead of the usual pen wash consistency, which is a little heavier, I'm going to go with a more diluted version of it for the first step here. You could probably even call it a filter if you want. I mean, if you really want to split hairs over it. Now, as I put this brown wash on the surface of the Zimmerit here, something occurred to me. I don't like it. Now, maybe it's just not thin enough, but I don't think that's the real problem. I think it's not dark enough. It's not a dark enough brown to be doing the pen wash / filter over the Zimmerit. And it's just going to end up looking, I think, a little bit more like a dark rust wash than anything else. And that's not what you want with Zimmerit because there are no metal parts to it and Zimmerit doesn't actually rust itself. Now the brown does work okay as a pen wash on the other parts of the model. And you can see here, I'm applying it and cleaning it up around some of the surface features like the cargo hooks and the braces that hold the shirts on the side, stuff like that. So I got the brown pen wash on half the upper hull here, half the casemate thing with the Zimmerit on it. And I really need to fix it. But because it's oil paint, I've got a lot of working time, so I'm not going to panic. And I'm going to kind of proceed onward and use the other Zimmerit sides of this thing to see if I can dial in the color that I actually want for this. So switching to the other side, I dumped the brown wash and started using Starship filth. I started to think about maybe using a black oil wash for this, but I think that might be just a little too dark. The Starship filth I'm using is from Ammo. It's from their oil brushers line. So it's a little thinner than traditional oil paint, and it does actually dry a little faster too, but not so fast that it negates the advantage of having a lot of working time, which is the great thing about oils. Now I'm not going to try to slather the entire surface with the wash. I really just want to hit the edges, the corners, and get into some of the random spots where the dirt and grime would really get built up within the grooves of the Zimmerit. Now I did the pen wash around the surface details here with the same color, just like on the brown side of it. And I went a little heavier with the paint mix on this one because it's pretty much just the same standard pen wash approach. Apply, clean, rinse, repeat, etc., etc. Now I am much happier with the results on the Starship filth side. And I don't have a good video of it, but I did go back and hit the upper part of the casemate with this stuff too, and I think it turned out really well. Now, this leaves me with another problem. I really can't have two brown sides to the Brummbär and two grayish sides. So now what? So now I still have to figure out how to come in and tie this all together without having to start all over again. And this is kind of another tricky part of the equation with a Zimmerit model like this. The overall tone has to match, i.e. the parts with the Zimmerit on it have to match the parts that don't have Zimmerit on it. And so you've got your Zimmerit parts, which are already going to be a little darker with just the faintest amount of oil wash on it, right? And then you've got your other surfaces, like the top here, the rear engine deck, stuff like that. That's going to be a lot lighter. And it's going to take a little bit more work to give it the same kind of tone as the darker Zimmerit parts here. But I'm going to get to that in just a minute. after my experience with the brown pin wash and then the Starship filth, I decided I'm actually going to go in with a black pin wash for the top and the engine deck here and the other non-Zimmerit areas of the tank. The Zimmerit texture helps the wash look a little darker just on the basis of the ridges and grooves. There's naturally occurring shadows in there. So I thought the reason I'm going with the black wash on the other surfaces without the Zimmerit is that it would actually help me match the tone a little bit better than if I just went with the same Starship filth color that I used on the Zimmerit sides of the vehicle here. Again, pretty standard pin wash stuff here. I do have to point out that there's actually a lot of little surface details up here on this thing. We've got the bolts, the cupola, the periscope housing, hatches, things like that. So it's really important to get the pin wash correct on these surfaces here. Again, nothing revolutionary. I'm going to apply it. I'm going to let it touch dry, and then I'm going to come back and clean it up with some white spirits. And then I'm going to come back and do it all over again. Now, in addition to the pin wash, I wanted to get a nice dirty, grimy effect on the top parts of the vehicle here where the crew is going to be constantly moving around. The hatches, the cupola, things like that. So I went back to the oil paints and used a mix of black and brown and a little bit of the Starship filth too. And I'm just kind of laying it down around the hatches and some of those other features. Same on the engine deck and that part of the back. And then I'm just going to come back in and blend it out. I want to try to make it look worn down and aged, like aged filth that's just really been ground in, and it's like almost just part of the vehicle in the same way the paint is right now. All right, now this chipping part is pretty much just your standard run-of-the-mill sponge and brush chipping routine. I went in with the light chipping on a sponge first, and I used AK's Light Dust from the 3rd gen line of paints. There's a whole range of colors you can use when you're chipping against German dark yellow surface like this. But since I was a little darker on this one with the yellow base coat that I put on it, I wanted to make sure I had something that really kind of matched the surface color here. And I felt like this light dust was the best option for that. Another thing to consider here was I didn't want it to look too much like the Zimmerit chipping, which I'm going to get to in just a second. And I think this color really achieved that for me. And now for the dark color chipping, I'm going to use the brush, and the color I'm using here is Dark Rust from Vallejo. It's pretty squarely in that tight-knit little family of chipping colors, if maybe a little bit lighter than, say, the chocolate chipping that you see in a lot of paint lines now. And once again, I just wanted to make sure this stood apart from the red oxide primer that I'm going to be using for the big spots where the Zimmerit's been knocked off. So I still need to fix the brown wash situation on the Zimmerit parts where I did that. But before I go back to the oils, I think I really have to get in and do the Zimmerit chipping and get that done. That way the tone will match from side to side rather than having a bunch of stark whitish and primer red chip spots on the surfaces that I've already darkened versus the ones that I haven't yet. And I created the damaged areas in the Zimmerit during the application process. Because Zimmerit was naturally applied over the primer coat at the factory when these things were, coming off the assembly line, the paste tends to get knocked off when it gets out in the field. And what's going to happen is that paste gets knocked off in some spots where it gets really big chunks of it. It's going to get pulled off and it's going to reveal the red oxide primer underneath the surface where that paste gets chipped away. Now it seems a little bit bright at first, but that's what I want because this is going to get toned down when the oils come out. In hindsight, I kind of wish now, going through this part, I wish I'd created some larger damaged spots in the Zimmerits because you can really kind of have some cool effects with those, but the spots I have here are going to have to work. Now, once the red paint is on, it's time to go back and use the lighter color to do that part of the chipping for the Zimmerit. And for this, I'm going to go even lighter than what I did for the non-Zimmerit surface, and I'm going to get the Creme of Ice from Ammo Atom here. It's not quite ivory. It's definitely not yellow. It's kind of somewhere in between. It's very light. I guess as the name applies, it looks a little bit like a coffee creamer, but maybe just a little bit more yellow than that. Now for the large red spots, there would still be, in most cases, residue left over from the Zimmerit paste where the Zimmerit gets chipped away. Now the first time I ever did a Zimmerit model, I just did the light colors around the edges on the red chips like this. But this time I wanted to give it a little bit more detail, and to do that, I'm trying to paint in some of the lines that would naturally be created by the Zimmerit patterns, the application of the Zimmerit patterns. and where those lines would still be there, even though the paste itself is getting knocked away. Kind of the main reason I wish I would have made some of those bigger chipping spots in the Zimmerit, damage spots rather, because that makes a really neat effect with that kind of level of detail in the damage, and really kind of helps draw in the viewer's eye to the model when it's finished. Now, after getting the chipping color around the red primer spots on the Zimmerit, I'm going to come in and hit the rest of the Zimmerit with the sponge and my creme of ice color. And this is just where the paint itself has been chipped off the Zimmerit. I want to emphasize the corners and the edges and the other places where the vehicle would naturally incur this kind of damage to the paint. You're hitting buildings, trees, whatever this thing's going to run into on its way to and from the battlefield. Now, the sponge chipping is nice. It's certainly easy, but I find that it can't effectively do everything you want when it comes to chipping, especially on the Zimmerit surfaces here. So I broke out the brush with my creme of ice color here too, just to hit a few specific spots, like some of these areas up front around the crew hatches, places like that just need a little bit more than the sponge can deliver. Another hindsight thing here is I realized that dry brushing would also maybe accomplish a lot of the same effect on the Zimmerit chipping here. I've also seen people do this with splashes, the same way you do splashes effect with like mud and dust and dirt in that weathering step. You can kind of also get that same chipping effect on the Zimmerit. Again, there's the great thing about modeling. There's more than one way to do things, and it's a lot of fun to try them all out. Another thing I did, went up to the top and the back of this thing, and I hit the bolts themselves with a little bit of the silver metallic color. I don't know if it's 100% historically accurate, but I think it adds a nice little pop of detail to the surface, one extra little surface feature. And with that done, it is now time to try and fix the sides where I did this brown oil paint when I first started the weathering process on this thing. Wish me luck. Rather than complicate things, I decided to just start with the simplest approach. And if this doesn't work, I could find another way. But yeah, I just took a large brush, dampened with thinner, maybe a little bit more so than you would use for like blending oils. And I just tried to use that brush to get rid of as much of the brown wash as I could. And I feel like I did a pretty decent job. It's not entirely gone, but what's left there isn't so overwhelming that it's going to interfere with that Starship filth wash I'm going to bring in and put over the top of this. Now, I didn't get a very good video of the new layer of wash I did with the Starship filth, but it's pretty much the same thing as the other side. There's still a slight brown tint visible in a few spots underneath it, but I think like I said earlier, it doesn't really conflict enough with the overall tone to, like tear it down and start again or make it look weird and awkward and totally fake. In fact, you could maybe argue that it even gives it a little extra griminess in a few spots here to make this thing look like it's really getting a lot of use out there on the battlefield. Now, after going through and redoing the brown wash surfaces from before, I felt like the front part of the vehicle still needed a little bit more contrast to it. Basically where the casemate rises up from the lower hull here, the front armor plate, whatever it's called. And also, I think there's a lot of little surface features on here, like this viewing cupola, the gun mantlet, things like that really give a lot of extra detail and require a little bit more attention to the weathering process here to help make those things stand out. Now, to do that, I'm just going to use a black oil paint this time because I'm only really trying to get spots where the parts come together. It's a pretty standard procedure. I'm just going to dab it into the various nooks and crannies with a slightly wet brush. And I'm just going to kind of go around those surface features and let them dry a little bit more. And then I'm going to come back and start to blend it in. I don't want it to be too stark, but I do want to create some shadows in those parts to help define the surface features. Now, there's one more step I took to get the tone on the sides to better match the overall look of the vehicle, just because I thought it was still maybe a little dark at this point. And this is pretty much just the classic oil dot filter technique. And I only did it on a few select spots here. I concentrated the lighter colors up near the top on the big sides of the casemate, and then I blended it down with a flat brush, just ever so slightly damp with thinner. Now, if you're working on an AFV without texture on the slopey sides like this is where you'd want to create some streaking effects. But with the Zimmerit and these horizontal ridges that it has in it, I think this part of it at least, the streaks just don't work quite the same as they would on a flat surface. So that's something you have to consider when you're using an oil dot filter on this. All right, now that's almost it for the Zimmerit, except for some of the dirt, dust, and mud weathering that I'm going to come back with. But I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. And like I said, we still got the other weathering, the dirt and dust stuff to go, but that's another area that can get a little tricky when it comes to a surface like Zimmerit. And I usually try not to get too heavy with the weathering, the dirt and dust weathering specifically, but I thought maybe a little bit of a mud effect would be appropriate here. Not buried in the swamp or anything like that, but just some wet dirt that's built up in parts of it. Since this is kind of supposed to be inspired by a unit somewhere on the Italian coast opposing the Anzio landings in 1944. So here I just followed my standard playbook for dust and mud. I did do one thing differently though. Instead of the oils or even the enamels to start, I went in with the AK terrain paste, the dry earth. Again, this isn't really uncommon. You see it done a lot out there. I haven't myself gone with this approach as much. But yeah, I just dabbled on the lower parts to start with, and then before it dried, I went back and kind of blended it in a little bit more. Make sure the thicker stuff was more confined to the lower edges, the cracks and crevices on the underside, underneath the fenders, places like that where it would get built up. And then I went back in and just kind of blended up to help create that dust effect a little bit. I didn't want the paste to obscure all of the details throughout the lower hull because I worked really hard on those, and I think it makes a nice effect. So again, I went in and cleaned up some of that stuff too. With the terrain paste on, but while it's still a little wet, I went back in and started blending pigments. I started with a darker one, and then I layered in the dust-colored pigment with that, and I'm just kind of smashing it in before this stuff dries completely, the acrylic paste. I like to start with the lower hull because by the time you put the tracks and wheels on it, and the Sturmpanzer in this case, it's not going to be super visible, so if you mess up, you've at least got some practice before you move to the other parts of the vehicle where it's going to be a lot more obvious and a lot harder to hide your mistakes. Now, one big difference with the Zimmerit paste like this that you're going to notice is just how well the pigment that is sticks to the surface. The grooves in the Zimmerit give it a natural surface to grip onto. You still are going to need some kind of fluid to lock it into place, whether that's pigment binder, enamel thinner, oil paint, whatever. But yeah, I really like the way the pigment works in conjunction with the Zimmerit surface here. All right, so with the dirt and dust on the vehicle, it was time to move up to the Sturmpanzer skirts here. And the first step was to come in with some enamel rust wash to really give it that rusty metal look. And you can kind of see where I've already done the chipping here. That was just your standard sponge and brush approach to chipping, easy peasy. And once that was done, I came back with enamels and hit it with the splash effects. I did the splash effects all over the vehicle, not just the Sturmpanzer. And I used a mix of a darker product and a dust-colored one to kind of simulate fresh and dry dirt and mud that's been splashed up on there. And with that, I let it all dry and cure for a few days before going back and giving it a nice coat of VMS matte varnish. I dropped in the commander here. I added this rather panicked-looking infantry officer. I added some stowage, and voila! Here it is. The Brummbär. All in all, I'm pretty happy with the final results. I think I was able to successfully work around the mistake of the brown wash on the Zimmerit that I started with. Feels like there are a lot of takeaways here where I could do it better the next time. But again, I'm not disappointed with the result by any means. All right, so let me know what you think in the comments. Is there anything you would do differently if you were doing this kit? And again, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. My name is Ryan, you're watching Sprue Goo, and be sure to stay tuned for lots more modeling content.